Okay, welcome to Streams in the Raw. This is where I do streaming on subjects, mostly going to be focused on things like Dungeons and Dragons, and these are unedited streams. That's why they're in the Raw. One of the most popular questions I've been asked, and I've also seen on Facebook and other social media like Reddit, is how to use the challenge rating system in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition in order to build encounters. Or I see comments like the challenge rating system doesn't work, the encounters are too easy or the encounters are too hard. And so I'm going to go over building challenging encounters in the challenge rating system. For my own qualifications, I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 42 years. For those who don't know, I'm Clyde Starr. I am one of the store DMs over at Metagames Unlimited, and I also help put on the Gaming Arts Media Entertainment Expo, where I run the RPG College, where my main goal is to teach people how to play role-playing games, and most specifically, Dungeons and Dragons. So let's jump right in. Like I said, the title of this one is Challenge Ratings and Building Challenging Encounters. Now, the first thing that you need to know about the challenge rating system in 5th edition is there's a basic assumption they built the system around. I mean, they didn't just arbitrarily assign the numbers of the challenge ratings on the creatures that you're going to be dealing with. You see on your screen a list of some of the stuff we're going to be going through, and I'll highlight it as we go along. I'll also switch over to D&D Beyond for some visual. You're not going to get to see my pretty mug, unfortunately. I'm not running my camera today. But the first basic assumption of 5th edition. Okay, I did not mean to do that. This is the whole in the raw part of it. I wanted to highlight the whole line there. First base of the assumption is that it's based on a party of between 3 and 5 PCs. If you check in the Dungeon Master's Guide in Chapter 3, and you scroll down to creating an encounter, it gives you some information what is considered an easy, medium, hard, and deadly encounter, and how to build it according to an experience point threshold by character level. And then it goes through a few different steps. But the partway through the 5th step, it really doesn't get a step of its own. It's just basically another section, is party size. And it tells you right there that the guideline assumes that the party consists of 3 to 5 adventurers. So that's one of the basic assumptions of the character party for making challenge ratings. Another assumption, which they don't actually straight point out in the game, but it is considered the default method. The assumption is your characters were built using the point buy or standard array method of stat generation. This is because it gives all members of the party basically an even baseline, not an evil one, an even baseline of their standard ability scores, but they can move them around a little bit to customize their character, give them a little bit more individualism. But speaking of characters, they're on the same plane of battle, whereas like the dice roll method, you could have characters with scores under 8 and no higher than 12 or 13 and still make a viable character. And the same party, you could have a character with starting with two 18s and a 17, and no score below 10 or no score below 12. And with racial modifications, that means that they could start the game with a 20 in one of their stats. And of course, that's the current natural cap without using magic in 5th edition. So um, that definitely puts a different spin on the abilities of the characters to overcome obstacles. So the basic assumption is that they're going to be using point buy or standard array. It also does not take into account magic items. Previous editions, especially 3rd edition, which was the start of the challenge rating system, automatically baked in magic items into what was assumed that the characters would have at a given level. By this level, you would have a +1 weapon and a +1 armor. By this level, you would have an item that gave you like these extra type abilities. It didn't have specifics, but it did bake into it a certain power level of magic items at every level. And so that was baked into the challenge rating system. And that continued on to 4th edition. 5th edition is the first edition since the challenge rating system started that was not automatically baked into the basic assumption. And the initial assumption, of course, when they were building the challenge rating system, was based around information in the player's handbook only. At the time when they were making the challenge rating system, they did not have Xanathar's Guide to Everything. They did not have Volo's Guide to Monsters out yet, and it had not been built around those extra options, how they interacted together. Now, true, those books were built kind of around this already existing framework, but there were some unforeseen interactions. So that's one of the reasons why, the challenge rating system doesn't 100% work, but it does work better for beginning DMs, which is what it's for, if you're making characters under the basic assumption as well. That's why I do recommend, if you're a first-time DM, using the challenge rating system where you haven't quite built the knack of building encounters for yourself, that you maybe start in quote-unquote easy mode by running a pre-built adventure, or if you're building your first adventure, try to kind of limit your character's options a little bit to the player handbook initially. I'm not saying you need to do that all the time. I'm just saying that do that, but definitely go for the point buy or standard array method of stat generation, unless you really want to do a bunch of extra work in rebalancing your encounters, because that is the basic assumption. And try for a party of 3 to 5 PCs. Me personally, I like much bigger parties than that, but it takes some adjusting, getting used to. I'm used to much bigger parties. I run 8 to 12, typically with as many as 20 being run before. And one thing that 4th edition, I'm gonna refer back to older editions sometimes in this. 4th edition, the one thing they really got right, except for the assumption of magic items, was their challenge rating system was based around the individual PC, not a party of 3 to 5. That means every time you added a PC, you could easily, quickly readjust the challenge rating. Where 5th edition basically assumes that you have a party of 3 to 5, and for each character less than 3, they have you go down a scale on the multipliers for multiple enemies, and each time you added a PC, you went up a scale for the multiplier for enemies, which is in the section we were looking at in the EMG, because right above there under encounter multipliers, if you have a single monster, the multiplier is, of course, 1. However, if you've less than 3 party members, that drops to 0.5, which is detailed in the writing below. And if you have 15 or more, you actually have 5. Times 4 on the multiplier. And this is just looking at number of monsters. Now, if you add players, that bumps down again. So if you have 15 or more monsters, but you have 7 players, that's 2 steps back. So it would be 2.5 times the experience point budget when building your encounters. And that's how 5th edition handled it, which is not quite as exacting as 4th edition, where you had a per player XP budget, and you had a per monster XP cost. And between those two, you could exactly create it, and it was already built in to the system, the fact that you were going to do multiple monsters based on multiple characters. And the action economy was such that you could still do it. Really, really large battles could get unwieldy, but for the most part, you could still handle it. And the other thing 4th edition did is it had monsters of different roles. Already your player characters are of different roles in the battle. And so you have your tank, your big beefy guy like your fighter, your paladin. You have your damage dealers like your rangers and your rogues and your warlocks and sorcerers. You have your area control specialists, which is typically your wizards and your big blasty types like some druids. And you have your buffers, your what they called leaders in 4th edition, which were the people who could buff your allies and weaken your opponents. They had the healing abilities. They had Bless, and they had Bane, and they had Fairy Fire. So we're talking about your clerics and your bards mainly. And those were the roles for the player characters. And then in the monsters, they had skirmishers, which were, really good in mobility and very similar to the rogues. They had skulkers, were even better than skirmishers, because they were better at the other part of roguishness, which was hiding, sneaking up on people, ambushing. They had ranged characters, which were called the artillery. They obviously specialized in range type attacks. They had brutes, which were big, just muscle bound types. Then they had soldiers who were not just necessarily muscle bound, but better armored. So they actually had more roles for the monsters than they had for the characters. And then, of course, they had 2 special roles, which was called the elite and the solo monster. An elite monster was the equivalent of 2 monsters of the same level. So each elite monster should be able to take on 2 player characters. And it was a way to control the too many enemies on the battlefield challenge thing. Instead of having 1 enemy per player character, you could have an elite per 2 player characters. And then it could have some regular adventure types. And then you had the solo monster, which was the equivalent of 5 player characters. They usually had some multiple attack options, higher hit point threshold, better armor class and saving throws, and so that they could handle a bigger party. But they were still at a level that the party could handle. So a 5th level elite was for a 5th level party. Instead of going out and picking a 8th level monster to bring down to attack your 5th level party and calling that the boss, you could use the 5th level elite and have that as a boss level or mini boss level monster. And then I didn't mention, but they also had another role, which was called the Minion. Minions had 1 hit point. They were not affected by residual damage type abilities. Like half damage. They didn't auto die and stuff, but they only had 1 hit point, so they're really easy. But you could use a minion of a much higher level and bring them down to a lower level party and make them more challenging. Like a fifth level party might have 3 or 4 eighth level minions. They've only got 1 hit point, but they're much harder to hit because they typically had the same defenses and attacks kind of as their level, although they did only average damage. They didn't even have a dice roll, and they were used to build your encounters to flesh out your bosses and your mini bosses, and even your bigger non-boss level encounters. So anything in your hard to deadly, where you might have a couple of big brutes to attack the party, and they needed a couple of servitors or minions, which is why they use the term, to flesh it out. That's those kobold servitors, the orc slaves and stuff that follow the orc war chief. And so that's how that was built. Well, 5th edition doesn't have that, but as several people have said, including Matt Koval, which you can find on YouTube, you can bring in the idea of the minion and the elite and solo creatures into your 5th edition game. And it's one of the things that is probably one of the best things to borrow from 4th edition. 5th edition is great because it is inspired by all the editions that came before it, more than some of the other editions were. 5th his design philosophy was to try to make an edition that would appeal to players of all editions, and that includes the people that played 4th edition, even though it was probably one of the least accepted editions, at least here in the United States. It's still probably one of the most accepted in Japan. It's the second most popular role-playing game currently in Japan, right behind Call of Cthulhu, actually. So it is not that it wasn't accepted, it just wasn't accepted real widely in the United States for various reasons, which we're not going to go into. We're not doing edition wars here. But so this is what the 5th edition design philosophy is based upon, is these basic assumptions. Now, and that brings us to the next bullet point on my list, which is encounter building is an art more than it is a science. The building of encounters is something you're going to pick up as you go along as a DM. I like to encourage people not to be afraid of picking up the DM screen, and this is probably one of the things that might scare them more than anything, is the fact that it is intuitive. It is something that you will learn as you go. It's not something that most people, there are people that can, but most people aren't going to pick up the DM shield and right away become Satine Phoenix and Matt Mercer and Matt Koval and TJ Storm and Chris Perkins. You're not going to immediately be Gary Gygax's reincarnation for the most part. You're not going to immediately know how to do everything to make the adventure fun, but you're going to build into that. It's not something that, unless you're what they call a prodigy, most people don't pick up a musical instrument and immediately play Bach either. They don't pick up a baseball glove and become Babe Ruth. Put on a boxing glove and become Muhammad Ali. It's just not how it works. And I'm using, of course, older examples. Mike Tyson could be used instead of Ali. I don't know any of these others, more modern sports people. My girlfriend points out Nolan Ryan is a modern, I assume, baseball player. Obviously, I'm a nerd. I do D&D, not sports. So, but anyway, it is an art more than it is a science. So, but there is some things you do need to keep in mind when you're starting out, and then as you get better and better, you still want to keep these kind of in the back of your head, because it's going to make for a better encounter building experience in the art of encounter building. First off, your encounters should fit your scenario. I mean, that sounds like it might be a no-brainer, and it sounds a little vague too. But it means, like, for instance, if you are in a ship at sea, you're probably not going to be fighting a whole bunch of fire elementals. And if you're in a lava-filled volcano, chances are there aren't going to be a lot of Sahagan, which are fish people, guarding said volcano. So you do want to fit your scenario. If your scenario is coastal, use coastal type creatures, in addition to, whatever the coastline has right next to it. So you can have forest creatures and coastline creatures come together at your coastal village that's between a forest and a coastline. But your chances are, if there's no desert for 500,000 kilometers or miles away, you're probably not going to have a bunch of desert dwelling creatures or Arctic creatures coming in on this coastal village. If you've got a verdant jungle, you got a lot of heat, you're not going to have a lot of Arctic creatures coming in to attack people unless they're magically summoned, and you can take that into effect. Magic, of course, is the great trump. Magic can trump anything and make it to where you can have a water creature in the middle of a fire domain. The next thing you want to take into account, and this is very important, is your party composition and their style of play. Now, I'm not saying that you tailor every encounter exactly to your party, because that gets to be a little metagamey, and the DM can metagame. Players don't metagame. The DM can metagame to an extent, because he's in charge of the fun for everybody. He's supposed to make it an interesting encounter. And so what he does is he adapts to the players and their style of play, and that includes the composition of their party. So if the party is really, really heavy on rogues, for one, he's going to put a lot of encounters that include traps and hazards where the rogue's evasion and the rogue's ability to detect and disarm traps will be used. And he's also, and I say he as a general, but actually it's he or she, will also, put creatures that can sometimes detect hidden ambushy type characters, creatures with tremor sense and blind sight or true sight that will be able to see in the invisible or see that skulking character as if it's bright as day, that shadows don't affect them. And see is in quotes, because of course tremor sense means you're feeling the vibrations on the floor. Or they might have keen senses and detect you by your sense of smell, instead of just sight and sound. Web sense, for like spiders, anything that disturbs their webbing, which is a different type of tremor sense, which would tell arachnids like giant spiders and driders that you're in their webbed kingdom. Even they might break something as thin as a cobweb and not even feel it, but the spider feels it. So you'll do that if they have a lot of rogues in the party. If the party is full of tanks, a lot of characters in 18 to 20 or higher armor class running around, you're going to want to use more monsters that have multiple attacks, gives them more chances to roll that higher hit. You're going to use monsters that have advantage so that they have more chances to hit that higher hit. You're going to want to use monsters that use attacks that aren't directly attack roll based. They're going to be saving throw attacks because they'll bypass that high armor class. And you're going to, of course, want to vary the different saving throws that you're fighting against, just so that if they're really strong in armor class and, say, dex saves, you can hit them with an intelligence or wisdom save. You want to do varied attacks anyway, just to make things interesting. The thing you do want to remember, though, when you're doing that is, do not eliminate the advantages that the character's choices made. They made these choices to try to get an advantage. You don't want to eliminate that advantage. You do want to mitigate it to an extent. You don't want it to make it a skeleton key. It's not going to get through all of your adventures and turn everything into a cakewalk. So you will build some, but you're not going to make every single encounter and every single villain eliminate the powers. Like, say you have a bunch of casters in your group and they all use fire. You're not going to suddenly send them against nothing but creatures immune to fire, because that wouldn't be fair. And that would be setting out to kill the players, which goes on to the next bullet point in this particular section of my talk, which is do not set out to kill the party. But remember, the PCs can die. And that's an important distinction. The game of Dungeons and Dragons is not adversarial. An often used chestnut out there is it's not the DM's job to kill the players. It's not completely accurate, because it is the DM's job to present situations where a character can die. Because without that threat of death hanging over them, it makes them feel immortal, which takes away a lot of the drama and a lot of the suspense, the edge of the seat action that gets the adrenaline pumping, that makes them more and more submerge themselves into the game. If they feel like the DM is using his caveat to constantly rescue them from every life or death situation, they're going to just start doing more and more foolish actions, because they know the DM is never going to punish them for it. They need to have consequences for their actions, and they need to know that the threat of death is real. Killing an occasional character is not wrong. Doing a total party kill is not necessarily wrong, but setting out to kill the characters, setting out to do a total party kill, is not the same thing. When you are going to make those adventure encounters that are going to be especially deadly, it's a good idea to telegraph that to your players. Put lots of warnings out there. Subtly remind them that running away is an option. As the next point says, some encounters are not meant to be beaten in combat. I don't know where that D came from. You can talk your way out of an encounter. You can sneak past an encounter. You can disguise yourself to get around an encounter, or you can go another way. There are various ways to beat an encounter that don't include killing the monsters or being killed by the monsters. And then finally, you can run away from an encounter, go lick your wounds, get a little bit stronger, then try again, maybe change up your strategies a little bit. This is especially true with like boss encounters. There's adventures written where the boss or mini bosses under the boss or avatars of the boss show up multiple times earlier in the adventure to taunt the party, weaken them a little bit, then they run away. Not because they're afraid of the party, but because the whole point there is to slow them down and discourage them, but not necessarily kill them right off the bat. But that's another way that you're telegraphing that this is going to be a tough boss. He's already come in, he's knocked several hit points off of you, he's made you use up some spell slots, then he got away scot-free, and you know that he's going to get healed up himself, maybe get access to some of his better magic items, pull more minions in around him to protect him, and have home court advantage because he'll be in his lair. So these are the things you can foreshadow by bringing in a little mini encounter with the boss or the mini boss. And so players need to realize that not every encounter is meant to be defeated. Overcome, yes, but even overcoming might mean running away to fight again. Uh, and that's, like I said, the next point was parties should know it's okay to run away from a losing battle. Then finally, there's remember the rule of cool. If it sounds like it will be fun for the players, try it out. Now, it's not always going to work. You, as the DM, might think it sounds really fun for the players to go through this gauntlet of monsters after monsters and monsters with no more than like a 10 or 15-minute rest between encounters. And sometimes that can be quite cool. Depending on the play style of your characters, they might be built for it. If you've got a group of mostly melee combatants that have got a lot of abilities that aren't limited, that just like to fight, they're loaded down with healing potions. They got a couple of good healers in the party as well. They might want to work that gauntlet all the way. That's totally what you might be in town and want to do, like an arena gladiatorial combat kind of thing. They think it's cool to come out and get that glory. You might want to do some kind of magical etcher drawing, where you can climb on the walls and the ceiling, and your point of gravity keeps shifting, and you can try that out. Just realize that the more you break certain laws of physics, the harder it's going to be to necessarily run said encounter believably. And believability doesn't have to be fully in there. The more magic involved, the less believability is important. But regardless, the point of this section is that it is an art form to create encounters. Use a mix of monsters. Use monsters of different roles. Like I mentioned in 4th edition, they had multiple roles of monsters. Well, 5th edition still has monsters that do different things, and you can combine them together. I mean, often we combine harder and weaker monsters of the same basic tribe together to attack people. Goblins are often encountered with hobgoblins and bugbears, which are all goblinoids. And they each have like different roles. The goblins are more of your stealthy, mobile fighters. Hobgoblins are more soldiers who might wear good armor, but they've got military discipline. And bugbears are brutes that do like massive amounts of damage, or like your barbarians. So you combine those together. In with your goblins, you might have a few that are more crossbow users than ones that get right up close. You might have a spellcasting goblin to give you some magical support. So build encounters that are interesting. If your party includes 5 or 6 different types of characters, then why shouldn't your monster groupings include 5 or 6 different types of characters? Sometimes you're just going to come up across a pack of wolves, and chances are there's not going to be much difference in the pack of wolves. One wolf might be bigger and stronger than the rest. He's going to be the alpha. But otherwise, they're not going to have too many different abilities. But if you come up against like a group of demons, some demons are going to be ones that are really good at ranged, and some are going to be really good at close. Some are going to be good at both. Some are going to use magic to port other demons in. Some are going to use ice, and some are going to use fire. And you're going to vary it up so that the players are not going to get bored with the same slugfest all the time. Not that hack and slash isn't a perfectly viable play style. Some people like to just do hack and slash all the time. But remember, it is an art, not a science. Like, you can't just plug numbers into a like Cobalt Fight Club and get the perfect encounter. You can get guidelines from that. And that goes along with, actually, I need to point out, like I said, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, they do have the building the encounters multiplier for multiple enemies. For the most part, I throw that out. When you're a beginner, go ahead and use it. Once you start learning the art of it, you're going to learn how to balance your encounters, because different creatures, even of the same challenge rating, are going to have different abilities that change up the battle, as it points out in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Rimmerazes are a CR 13 creature that are immune to spells of level 6 and below. If you don't have a party member of, or if you have mostly party members of level 12, even though that's only one CR higher than them, technically you could send them against that and it would only be a medium to hard encounter, depending on how many you send. But your casters are completely shut down. If they don't have a single spell of a slot higher than 6, their magic is useless. So you got to take that into account. That's why in 4th edition they specifically said it, and I like to tell my people in 5th edition and in older editions, you generally never want to send the party up against a creature of 5 challenge levels above the average party level, more than 5. 5 is about the cap, and that's usually your boss level encounters. The exception being if you absolutely mean them not to fight the battle, if you want them to talk their way out, if you want them to run and come back when they're a little stronger. The whole point is not to beat the battle, but to use up some resources, and then the monster is set to let them get away or to leave themselves. Then you can use a creature that much higher. And of course, in an open sandbox area, that's another thing. In a sandbox type situation, players will come up across creatures of any challenge, because a sandbox area is not set for a specific encounter level. It's not like an MMO where you say, okay, you're going to be next to Quanos, the one of the starting cities in like EverQuest, and so everything right outside of the town is easy monsters, and as you get a little bit further away, they go up a little bit higher. Then you get the knoll area, and they're a little bit higher, and it's by area. No, in a sandboxy type of thing, like a regular wild forest, that's not your chief encounter areas. These are like between A and B. It's your travel areas. You could accidentally come up against the adult green dragon that makes its nest in that forest, because forests are areas where you might find a green dragon. Your party's not ready for an adult green dragon. They are meant to run away or avoid this encounter. At best, it's a reason the players need to always be on their toes. Now, you do give them exit strategies for these places. Make it so they can run away. Don't make it impossible for them to run away in these circumstances. But, give the believability of the area, make it so they do realize that not every encounter is meant to be beaten. Now, the next section I want to talk about is pillars of play, because, we're talking about encounters, and encounters, you think about the combat pillar, and that's the only one you think about, but there are 3 pillars of play in Dungeons & Dragons. There's combat, there's interaction, and exploration. Those are the 3 pillars in which the game stands on. And combat is considered to be where most encounters fall. Actually, I skipped over a section. Let me go back. By scrolling in it, I got distracted. You need to do your difficulty breakdowns first. This is in the raw, like I said, so there will be some missteps, but I warned you from the beginning. In the encounter difficulty breakdown, and you're not going to find this in most 5th edition books, you will find this in 4th edition's Dungeon Master Guide. It's slightly different in 4th editions, but I'll tell you how that is. But basically, 5% of your encounters should be easy. That uses up few, if any, resources. Usually 5 to 10% at most. You might lose a couple of hit points, spend a spell slot, unless you overreact and spend more resources than you should on an easy encounter, which sometimes is the point of an easy encounter, is trick somebody into using up a resource they're going to need to use later. If you've got a player that almost always has this like 3 spell combo they start every encounter with to make themselves nigh on invincible. Throw an easy encounter at them, make them use up those spell slots, and they won't have them for a later encounter, because the encounter day is also not set for 1 to 3 encounters a day. I think I left that off of the basic assumptions, and I did not mean to do that. But in the basic assumptions, let's add one more tick. So if I do this one again, I'll have it. And that is, they're built with the assumption of 6 to 8 encounters between long rests. And just to show you where I get that information, near the bottom of the encounter building chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a section called the Encounter Day, or the Adventuring Day, which it's near the bottom. Let's see, where am I at? I'm in Creating Encounters. And I know the Adventuring Day is in here. There we go, the Adventure Day. I missed it because of that artwork. The assumption of a typical adventuring conditions and average luck, most adventuring parties can handle about 6 to 8 medium or hard encounters in a day. That's the assumption that the CR system is built around. Okay, I expanded out a little bit because I'm not just sending people against medium and hard encounters. I'm sending them against easy encounters and boss encounters. So I'm going to use the older system that was detailed specifically in the 4th edition, and it's actually an older edition DMGs as well, just not always using reference to CRs. And that is 5% of your encounters should be easy. They use little or no resources, maybe 5 or 10% of your resources. So we're looking at anything where the CR of the encounter is below that of the party. 50% of the encounters should be medium, or what they call equal in other editions. That means they're about the same CR to 1 CR above the party. So CR of equal or +1 at best. And they're meant to use about 20% of the resources, give or take. Now 30% of the encounters should be in the hard category, using the terminology they use in 5th edition, which is a higher experience point allocation, because that's how they break them down in 5th edition. I use CR between +2 to +3, in some cases even +1 if it's particularly lower level party members, where +1 is actually higher by a bit. The average CR of the encounter is considered hard if it's +2 to +3. But this is where it kind of differentiates from the 4th edition chart, because at 4th edition and older charts, that 30% is actually broke down into 2 15%. The first 15% is just hard encounters. The other 15% are what they call tricky encounters. Tricky encounters means that it's generally hard onto deadly unless you have a specific item or specific strategy, or you use a specific element of the environment to mitigate the danger of the encounter. Like if a monster in the encounter can only be hit by this one particular weapon, let's say, which you can build adventures like that, where there's a special monster and a special weapon, and the only mundane weapon that can hurt it, or the only weapon, not mundane, but the only non-spell type attack that can hurt it for sure, or the only thing that can kill it, is this one weapon. Then you have to have that one weapon to make this encounter less than deadly. Uh, so it falls under the tricky encounters. It doesn't fall necessarily under the boss encounters yet, because with that one weapon, it makes it much easier. It can go down to almost a medium or even easy encounter, depending on what's happening. Like, for instance, were creatures. If you have a bunch of lycanthropes and they require everybody have either a magic weapon or silvered weapon, if you don't have magic weapons, silver weapons, it's more of a deadly encounter. If, on the other hand, you first buy a bunch of silver weapons or enchant your weapons or use spells like Shillelagh to make your weapon count as a +1 weapon, the lycanthropes are easier to beat. Another example is trolls. Trolls regenerate. If you don't know to use fire or acid on a troll to stop the regeneration, then they're going to keep regenerating. However, if someone in the party realizes that you can use fire and you guys brought torches and fire spells and vials of acid, you can still fight the troll and make it a much easier encounter. But without it, the troll's going to keep coming back. Unless you do nothing but crits, because often a crit also doesn't regenerate right away. So that's that 30%. They're tricky encounters. 15% of them are 15% of encounters. So half of those 30% are tricky and half are just hard. And then 5% of your encounters should be in the deadly classification. They can use up to 100% of your resources. Or technically more than 100%, as in you need to run away because they're going to take up more than you've got to give. And these are your boss and mini boss battles. We've all played video games, I'm sure. And the most exciting part of most video games is getting to that boss encounter. That's the one that's, I mean, most of the regular, what I call mooks, are easy or run of the mill. Then you get the boss, and the boss there's often a trick in the boss too. Specific combinations you need to use to beat the boss. The boss can often be a monster with character levels, which makes it a lot more difficult than you would expect, because characters options are meant to be used through a whole day of adventures. A boss only really has to worry about that one encounter most of the time. The next time you encounter them, if they do hit you earlier than later, they've probably done something to restore all their abilities they used up earlier. So yeah, giving a boss type creature character levels really amps up their power quotient quite a bit. And so 5% of your battles should be boss battles. And how that translates for those who are not into math, it's real easy. 5%, for every 5%, that's 1 in 20 battles. Now, I said before that the encounter day is based on 6 to 8 battles, and that may seem like a lot. I actually run between 8 and 12, 8 and 13 battles in a day, depending on the situation. I mean, obviously, there's not going to be a gauntlet of battle after battle after battle. If all you're doing is going through the King's Highway from point A to point B, there's not going to be that many bandits. There's not going to be that many wild creatures attacking the King's Highway that's already patrolled. It's just not going to be. On the other hand, if you're in a dungeon crawl, which is, of course, what the whole game is kind of based around, like if you're in Undermountain or Tomb of Annihilation or something where there's a lot of dungeony crawling, you could have lots and lots of encounters in a day, because people often forget that an encounter round takes 6 seconds of game time. Play time could take a lot longer than that, obviously, but it actually represents 6 seconds of simultaneous play, initiative aside. It's not 6 seconds per person's initiative, then you add them all up. It's the same 6 seconds. Everybody's acting, but in initiative order. And so a medium encounter, on average, can take no more than about 5 rounds to go through on average. So that means that your medium difficulty encounters are about 30 seconds long. In an adventuring day, if you actually read the rest area of the player handbook, you can only do one long rest in a 24-hour period. Now, you might be using a different scale of game days, but basically you get one rest per game day. That means that you, on average, have 16 hours to fill. If your average medium encounter takes 30 seconds, you could do a short rest, which is an hour, after every medium encounter, and that takes an hour. It takes an hour and basically 30 seconds. So you can absorb that 30 seconds. Just say it took an hour. So even if you have another hour of transitory role play, exploration, interaction, and stuff, that means that every encounter with accompanying role play and transitory information could be as close as an encounter every 2 hours. Every 2 hours in a day is 14 to 15 encounters. Actually, I mean, every 2 hours, I'm sorry, is not 14, 15, is about 8 encounters. I'm sorry. But you could technically have an encounter every hour. You can have an encounter every 30 minutes or less for most of the day if you're really going through a dungeon slog. I don't know where I got the 14. But you can have 8 or 9 encounters in a given day with a 16-hour day, given about a 2-hour bridge between encounters. And that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, even in a heavy roleplay group, a lot of them don't spend 2 solid hours role-playing with NPCs. I mean, that would be great if they did, but you also got to remember that, interaction in and of itself is an encounter. Not all encounters are combat. And that goes into our next section. The next section is the pillars of play, which I started to do earlier. There's combat, interaction, and exploration, and we think of combat as the encounter part of it. That's the one that has an experience budget. The experience is based on the monsters. So we all think of giving experience for combat encounters in an experience-based game. In a milestone-based game, not so much. Milestone-based games are based on achieving goals or milestones, getting to certain sections of the game. Once you get to this point in the game, you get a milestone. Or, the DM might even do what's called loose leveling, which doesn't use experience or really milestones at all. At certain points in the game, the DM says, everybody level up. And that's kind of how Critical Role does it. And that's how I do it in my one homebrew game. When I'm ready for people to level up, I tell them to level up. And that way I can have more control over the basic power level as they go through the adventure. And you're not required, unless you're in some kind of organized play like Adventures League or a store league or something, to use any particular method of advancement. But anyway, there are 3 kinds of encounters. There's combat, there's interaction, and there's exploration, because the whole game is basically considered kind of encounters, or scenarios, or arcs. And we think of the most typical encounter as the combat encounter. That is when you are a party directly in conflict with NPCs, usually monsters or villains, and it usually requires the use of combat skills and abilities to overcome. It's when you break out your sword, your maul, your crossbow, and your attack spells and abilities, and you go at it in a combat, and this is often where they use like a battle matter grid, although you can do it in theater of the mind. But the next section is interaction, and these are also encounters. In fact, they still follow a lot of the rules of encounters. You can even do interactions in initiative order. Purely interactive encounters include anytime the party must directly or indirectly interact with intelligent NPCs. And intelligent does not necessarily mean civilized. Uh, but it does mean that you can do interaction other than just fight them. So you usually have a way to communicate, even if it's pantomiming because you don't share language, but you're both smart enough to realize that the pantomiming means something. Uh, but it could also mean, even trying to calm an excited horse, or, try to curtail a stampede of cattle. Those are interactive encounters. If you're not using combat to bring it under, but instead using animal handling checks and charisma based skills like persuasion and bluff and intimidation. These are your interactions. Interactions are your charisma based encounters, um, where the most important spells aren't magic missile and fireball, they're charm person and calm emotions. Um, these are your interactive, and a lot of DMs will build an interaction encounter and put an experience point total at the end of it, or a milestone, or set specific goals within the encounter. If you do this, you get this many experience or a milestone, and if you do this, you get this many experience or a milestone. So, and you can build that into your encounter breakdown. So, when I'm doing 8 to 13 encounters in a day, some of those encounters can be interaction encounters if I'm going to give actual experience and expect them to use up some resources like spell slots or limited abilities. Then those are encounters that go into my breakdown, because the encounters for the breakdown purpose is use of resources. You have so many resources throughout the day. Your spellcasters have spell slots. When they run out of spell slots, they can only use cantrips. In the case of like sorcerers, they can use meta magic to get a few more spell slots, but only up to a certain extent. Bards have only so many inspirations they can use, but they can use them in combat or out of combat for skill checks. Um, Paladins have granted abilities like divine guidance, divine sense. They've got lay on hands. If you stop in a village and use lay on hands to cure a sick child, that's the lay on hands you have to use to cure a party member in the middle of battle. And it takes 5 hit points worth of lay on hands to remove a disease or poison from that child. That's 5 hit points that could have been used on a party member, or could have been used to cure poison or something on a party member. So you're using up resources. It definitely counts as a medium or higher encounter. Anything where you're barely using any resources at all, or you're using a resource that comes back pretty much with a short rest, you could possibly call that more of an easy or non-encounter for purposes of the breakdown. I mean, they use up time, but your interactions are encounters. And every spell slot you use to charm person in an interactive encounter is a spell slot you don't have to shoot a fireball, or to turn invisible to go around an enemy to ambush it, or to spider climb to get out of the way of monsters trying to attack you, or blink or armor or any of those things. Any leveled spell uses a spell slot, and if an interaction uses up a spell slot, unless you have some way to get that spell slot back, it's used until your long rest. I mean, warlocks have a slight advantage here because they get their spell slots back after short rest, but they only get a couple of spell slots per day period, as far as at any given time. They get them back after short rest, but they only ever have 2 between rests. So, 2, maybe 3. I don't remember if the higher levels possibly gives them a third one finally. I'm not looking at the chart right now. But they're very, very limited on the number of spell slots they have. Now, they're always cast at their highest levels, so that's an advantage too. But it's still a used resource. So when you're using your interaction encounters with resources, it's one of your resources per day. And that's where you have to start thinking not as 6 to 8 encounters a day, but 8 to 13 encounters a day, because every interaction counts if it uses up resources. And then exploration. Now, a lot of people don't think of exploration at all. It's the most underutilized pillar in Dungeons and Dragons. It's a part of Dungeons and Dragons. It's one of the 3 sections of Dungeons and Dragons, but a lot of times, a lot of it is hand waved. It's why some people think that the Ranger in the player handbook is underpowered, because too much of its abilities are more focused on this pillar, and people often hand wave a lot of this pillar. So that's a consideration. But exploration encounters are those that do happen. And the thing is, whenever the party is directly interacting with their environment, it's exploration. That means things like traps and hazards, which in some ways simulate combat, are more exploration pillars. And you're using up resources when you go against hazards. If you have to cast a levitate spell to avoid a hazard, you've used up a spell slot. If you have to do a detect traps spell to avoid traps, you've used up a resource. Mazes and labyrinths are also exploration types, and even just mapping unknown lands. Like you got to go to a newly discovered continent, and it's a wild continent. Nobody has any maps of it. They're not sure what's down there. You're probably going to get some combat encounters in there. You might get some interaction encounters in there, but the whole of it is also going to be exploration. And that's the thing. They intermix a little bit, quite a lot in some cases. But it can be a challenge when you're running from a overpowered combat encounter to try to still map at the same time. If your job is to go down and map a continent, you can't really be writing on your map while you're running from a saber-toothed tiger or a dinosaur or a mad wyvern. So there's some challenges there. When you're being chased in a cityscape, that's a exploration type of encounter, because you're interacting with the environment more than with people. So a chase scene where you're trying to lose a tail or tail somebody, it's kind of interaction and kind of exploration, and it uses up some resources. Anytime it uses a resource, it counts as an encounter. So it's not that I'm advocating for non-stop fight, as much as I'm advocating for the fact that encounters happen all day long. And anytime an encounter could use up an expendable resource, it counts as an encounter. So if it uses up spell slots, it's an encounter. If it uses up limited use ability like lay on hands or pass without trace or disguise self, it's an encounter. So you got to remember, these pillars of play are not just combat when it comes to encounters. And finally, when building your encounters, you want to include encounters of all 3 types. You do want to include them. Each has their advocates. I mean, there's the hack and slash player that just wants to go from combat to combat to combat. There's the political intrigue player that just wants to be in town doing different whodunit type things. They're doing, interaction and exploration. All of them are going to involve a little bit of exploration. There are people that just want to map out new areas, and the occasional combat encounter is a distraction from the mapping. And that's fine because you do want to play to the style of your players, as I said in the very first section. Well, second section. But when it comes down to it, you want to build in, adventures, scenarios, arcs, if you will, campaigns that use all three pillars. And the best encounters of all have elements of all three. Now, as an example of an encounter that has elements of all three, you're fighting a bunch of cultists who have kidnapped some villagers for sacrifice. You're interacting with the cultists, trying to talk them into letting the prisoners go. You're talking to the prisoners, trying to get them to calm down, or you might be sneaking over, interacting with the environment, which is exploration partly, to send your rogues in to possibly release some of the prisoners and sneak them out. And then while the party is distracting the cultists, the other part of the party is guiding some of the prisoners to safety, overcoming traps and hazards and obstacles while they're doing it. You're doing combat, of course, with fighting your bad guys, or counterspelling their spells. You're using your other skills to identify other hazards or other ways out. You're mixing all three pillars, and that's the optimum, is when you try to do encounters that do incorporate everything. It's a little bit more complex, but when you're building an encounter, like I said, it's an art form. And the more elements you put in the encounter, the more believable the encounter gets, because we don't exist in a vacuum. We're not a fighting video game where it's like combatant A is on one side of the screen, combatant B is on the other. Ready, fight! That's not it. You're not even in like old school Final Fantasy where you come up and you come up against the creatures and suddenly there's and then it is a battle where everybody takes their turn and then completely completes their turn and stuff. There are things happening in the midst of battle. You can enter and leave battle. And some of the later Final Fantasies had more of the ability to do exactly that, enter and leave battle. You could swap out characters and stuff, which at least added more to it. But we're not talking video games right now. This is the art of being a DM. When you're finally able to really start developing your art, you're going to quickly realize that the CR system for you is not important. You're not going to use it mostly. I mean, you'll use it barely as guidelines, but you're not going to use their multipliers. You're not going to use the CR numbers themselves, except for as experience totals, which the experience totals are separately listed on the monsters anyway, as anybody who has access to the monster manual can tell you. Let's do this. It's a little bit easier to get to the top. If you go to sources and you go to the monster manual, why am I in? Oh, yeah, see, I saw a book that was in another language, didn't recognize it. But you can go to monster manual, pick up any monster, and right there where the challenge rating is, it also has their experience total. So you can bring that into play. That's what you really need from the monster. That 1/2 challenge rating not going to mean a whole lot to you as an experienced DM after a while. I mean, you do know basically that 2 Jackalware are an appropriate challenge for a party of first level adventurers. Now, technically, you would multiply that up a little bit to go from medium to hard because of the fact that you have two monsters. But really, it's not, because you've got a party of 3 to 5 adventurers, and you really want to. And here's the other thing that we don't often talk about, but this is the real reason for the multipliers and everything, the underlying assumptions there that doesn't work. And I know they in Xanathar's, I haven't really heavily gone through the Xanathar's guide for encounters, but it does have a section on encounter building that's a little bit revised. But you do have to remember the action economy. 5th edition, 4th edition, both of those were really heavily involved with action economy. And basically, the more actions you can do in a turn, the more actions you want your monsters to be able to do in a turn. And on average, as one Facebook poster, I don't remember who it was, had stated, and I kind of agree with him, you count the number of actions, not bonus actions, not reactions, and not movement actions, the number of actions that a player can do. And you add up all the actions for your party and divide that by 2, round it up, and that's how many actions you want in monster actions. So again, actions, not movement, not bonus actions. So if you have 5th level fighters, 2 of them, each gets 2 combat attacks, 2 attack actions. They get 1 action, but it's 2 attacks. You could technically say that they've got 4 actions between the 2 of them. And then the wizard has 1 action, which could be a spell or what have you. And the druid has an action. But he could be in wild shape, technically, and have a creature form that has multi-attack. So it really has multiple kind of attack actions. We're not counting, like I said, bonus attack actions, though. Anything that uses your bonus action is not counted here. So you add up your total party. So say a party of 5 first level characters have 5 actions, just to be simple. That means that overall, the monsters that you have going against that party of 5 first level adventurers should, in a turn of combat, which is everybody's a combat round, get 3 actions, which is half of 5 rounded up. 2.5 rounds up to 3. So sending up against a single monster that has a single action is really advantage players. If you want to make it more even, fair, balanced, which are the keywords of 5th edition, you would want to add another monster, and maybe a minion-y type monster, to this encounter to bring it up to that first level of difficulty, because you've equaled out the number of attacks. That's the reason, like in 4th edition, they had solo monsters, usually had 2 attacks instead of 1 attack in a round, or attacks that affected multiple characters. So more area of effect type attacks, which kind of balanced out a little bit. And that's the thing. Area of effect kind of abilities kind of mitigate some of that. Now, granted, the players will have area of effect abilities too, so it's not 100%. It's art, like I said, it's not science. But as a general hard and fast rule, you want half as many total actions for the monsters as the players have. And that's up to equal numbers, because in low levels you can sometimes send creatures of a lower challenge rating in multiples to equal an account. Like a 1/4 challenge rating creature versus a first level party, you need 4 of them to make a first level challenge. But that would automatically bump it up with a multiplier, wouldn't it? But then again, if you have 4 or 5 party members and 4 or 5 quarter or eighth challenge rating monsters, you're really just evening them out, because most of those quarter challenge rating monsters only have 1 attack and they're relatively weak, and they're relatively weak on hit points, like even weaker than the player characters who start, uh, where most player characters start with a minimum of 6 hit points. That's for your wizard, and I think it's your sorcerer with no con bonus. But up to, um, given the basic assumption, your barbarian could have 15. If they have +4 for their con, well, no, can't even get +4 yet technically, so they could have up to 14. Wait, well, no, I'm not even doing that right. I'm forgetting. Barbarian can have a die 12, so they have 12 base. They got +3 under the standard array or point buy with racial modifiers. Could bring them up to a 17. So +3, it'd be 15, and then +1 more if they're a dwarf that gets +1 hit point per level. And he's also got the con mod. So he could have a 16 or 17 con and +1 hit point on top of that. If you're still not using any feats and stuff, he still has up to 16 hit points. And that's your maximum for one party member, as opposed to a lot of these quarter and eighth hit die monsters who are looking at like 7 hit points, 4 hit points. Let's see, let's look at a classic. I'm going to go ahead and get out of that and go back up to monsters, manual. Classic would be a kobold. Probably one of the most often used and underrated monsters in the game. You go to a classic kobold, is a 1/8 challenge rating creature with 5 hit points. Now, you could, and one way I do like to vary encounters, make them a little bit tougher if you need to, is instead of using the average hit points as listed here in the monster manual, go ahead and roll. It makes a little bit of unpredictability because some of these kobolds could have 14 hit points, and others of these kobolds might have 4 hit points. They average out at 5, which isn't really an average. Oh no, this is -2, not +2. Never mind. They could have as many as 10 hit points, or as few as minimum of 1. If you rolled 2 ones and -2, you always give them a minimum of 1. So the kobold could have 1 to 10 hit points, but their average would be a 3 on one die and a 4 on the other, with 7 -2 is 5. So that's how they got 5. But you could roll their hit dice and see what they have, and that varies a little bit. Doesn't really up the challenge. If you really want to specifically up the challenge, you can give them all maximum hit points. You can get rid of that -2. There are various things you can do there, but that's a classic 1/8 hit die creature. It's only got 5 hit points. Now, if you go up to, let's see, I want to go K monsters and go, I'm using the monster manual here because it's a great way to, and I could just be typing and searching. It probably would have been quicker. But let's go to Goblins, another classic monster. And I believe a 1/4 hit die monster. That's no. Oh, I might have missed the goblin there. Goblin, there we go. Goblins are a 1/4 hit die, and they only have 7 hit points. It's a straight 2d6, so they could have as little as 2, as much as 12, but they average out at 7 hit points, and they get 1 attack. Now it's either their short bow or their scimitar. They've got 2 types of attack, and you can change what weapons they've got. You can say that your goblins only have the scimitar, or only have a mace, which is what's actually pictured on that goblin, or only have a short bow. So these are just your ranged goblins. So you can mix your party up by saying some goblins are just short bow users, and some goblins are using scimitars, and some have got a mace, and that's fine for the varied part of it. But they're really, really easy. So those under 1 challenge rating creatures, I think you ignore the multipliers completely. The general rule of thumb is you want no more than 1 more creature than you have party members if you're going a first level party against creatures of under 1 challenge rating, because they're really meant to be in groups of, like, you could actually send 8 kobolds against 4 party members. It's really only 2 on 1, but they're so weak, they don't do a lot of damage, they don't have great hits, but their main challenge is their ability to overwhelm. You don't need to do a real multiplier on them until after you get like more than 1 more than the party. So if your party's 5 adventurers and you send 6 kobolds, it's still a challenge rating 1, in my opinion. But like I said, we're really throwing out the challenge rating system. But you do take into account action economy. So that means you look at creatures that have multi-attack. You look at creatures that have a lair and legendary actions, which give them additional attack. You can give a creature like a boss monster lair and legendary attacks that they don't automatically have. One great bit of advice I've seen for doing your bosses is if you use a regular boss at the level of the party and you're sending it in as a solo monster against your 3 to 5 characters, to up his action economy, you just give him you call him a legendary monster. You don't have to necessarily give him more hit points or anything, but he gets up to 3 legendary actions per round, and they're not on his turn. They're immediately after a player's turn, so they're like a reaction. And they have a choice of 3 actions they can do. They can do any one of their regular 1-action attacks, or they can move, or they can do some kind of recovery action. You can, like, say they can spend 1 of their hit dice if they have any available. Every creature has hit dice. Since this goblin is a 2 dice 6, he technically has 2 hit dice. Each one's a die 6. So you can say, if this was a legendary goblin, not a very powerful legendary goblin, but say a legendary goblin, technically he could heal himself for d6 as one of his legendary actions. And that's fine. Another recovery kind of thing they can do is take off a status effect that they're currently under as a legendary action. Now you could rule that as just eliminate the effect or give them another saving throw to that effect, if it is a saving throw type effect. But they have the ability to shrug it off as a boss. And that's an excellent possibility for your boss monsters to make them a little bit more threatening and intimidating, and make them match out the action economy of the players. Because, I mean, like I said, I run 8 to 12 players quite often, and so I really have to modify my adventures accordingly. I often have 1 combatant per player and do just fine. Everybody kind of squares off against somebody, and it's fine. I don't necessarily roll individualized initiatives for my monsters, and that's another thing you want to consider when you're building your encounters. How are you going to run initiative? The more monsters you have, the more you need to simplify their initiative, or your combats are going to grind. So, and that's something you don't want either. You want your combats to be memorable, epic, but not grindy. Uh, so if you have several mooks, like a bunch of kobolds, a bunch of goblins, group them together. All of the kobolds go at the same time. All the goblins go at the same time. In a mixed group, goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears, all the goblins go at one point, all the hobgoblins go at one point, all bugbears go at one point. And your general rule of thumb there is you can group any group by those with the same initiative modifier. So if your goblins and your hobgoblins have the same initiative modifier, you can have them just go together. Depends. Now, if you've only got a small number of monsters, or they're all different, you can give them individual initiatives. And a lot of people don't realize the initiative rule as written is not that you break ties with a dex check or initiative modifier check. The actual rule is if two players have the same initiative, they get to decide who goes first. And if for really dynamic combat, you can have them decide it every round. So if your bard and your fighter both go on 17, in round 1, the fighter can go on 17. In round 2, fighter goes on 17. Round 3, the bard goes on 17, fighter goes on 17.1. Basically, that means he goes right after the bard because he's jumped in because the fighter might need some healing before his next attack. So the bard jumps in. They're on the same initiative, so they're going simultaneously. But it's too hard to talk to two people at once about what they're doing. But it does mean that people on the same initiative can work together a little bit. You can also adjust the hold action to do that. So you can say, I hold my action until this player does this, so that your reaction is then used to do something in tandem with what they're doing. That's using strategy. Well, your monsters can do that too. Monsters all go on the same initiative. You don't have to use them in the same order every single time. Most DMs don't. They just pick one, do it, or move them all first, then have them all attack first. Then have them all attack second. Then have them all use bonus actions if they have them third. Or they may always have them do it in a certain order. Or monsters might have, like I said, different initiatives because they're different initiative modifiers, or they roll different initiative rolls and they're different types. So this is all part of your action economy and your initiative structure. But pick a method that works with your initiative tracking method, because one of the things I've seen more DMs get confused about is tracking their monsters and initiatives and who's attacking what. If you're using Theater of the Mind, it can get really difficult to remember who's attacking what monster. It's great to put in your notes a little like dash next to the monster each individual player is currently attacking and try to move them. If you've got one of those magnetic boards that came with Pathfinder, or didn't come from, but you can buy from Pathfinder, you could move your tokens next to the ones that are attacking. If you've got a whiteboard, you can do something like that. If you are using a battle mat, it's easier, but you also got to remember of similar monsters, which one's number 1, which one's number 5. I often use color-coded tokens. Like I might have kobolds. I tend to use tokens for monsters, and I might have, like, for instance, 5 kobolds on the board, and they'll either have a number 1 to 5 on them, or they might have different colored bases, and I'll say you're attacking the orange kobold and you're attacking the purple kobold, and so on. So you will need to look at that when you're building your encounters, because you want to build an encounter that's fun, that's engaging, that's epic at times. I mean, your easy encounters and even your medium encounters don't have to be super epic, but your hard and your deadly encounters should definitely be of an epic element, especially if you're going to end up having them run away. You're going to want it to be epic until then. You want to make it engaging for your party members, and part of that art is learning how to run the encounter. Use monsters that have abilities that interact with each other or complement each other. Use monsters that it makes sense will work together. Use monsters together that don't make sense and have the players try to figure out why those monsters that would never work together are working together. But have some underlying reason behind it. Don't just throw sylphs and magma men together. Don't just throw water weirds and dust methods together. Have a reason for it. Don't have a white dragon working with a black dragon. They don't work well together. But unless you've got an underlying reason for it. And then finally, we're going to go into boss battles, because that's one I've not... Boss battles and other battle complexities, I should say. I didn't put that out on my list, because this one's really getting into the art of combat. And they do talk about it in the DMG a little bit. The first one, I'm not talking about bosses yet, although this can be used in boss battles. It's not the primary use of it, but they do what they call battles in waves. It's again under creating encounters. And it's right above the adventuring day part of it, which we go over here. It's multi-part encounters. These are encounters where they're coming in waves, like you might have written in your notes that these 4 monsters attack them right away, and then on round 3, these reinforcements come to the monster's aid. Or this special monster reveals itself that's been in hiding and waiting. And so you are hitting them in waves. This is good for those, again, creatures that like to blow, or characters that like to blow all their powers all at once. I mean, for one, they're not preparing for multiple encounters in a day, but 2, they're not preparing for multiple encounters in an encounter. Encounters don't exist in a vacuum. You don't create an instance like you would in a MMO or something like Final Fantasy, where you're attacking and there's 5 monsters and you beat the 5 monsters, and when that's over with, you might come up against another encounter. No, you might come against 5 monsters, and as you're fighting those 5 monsters, 4 more monsters are joining the battle. And then later on, 2 monsters who haven't been killed run away, and 4 more monsters join the battle. You can make complex multi-part battles, and you generally put it in your notes as when you're pre-planning this. You set up monsters to come in at a specific round, a turn of combat. So you might say at the beginning of turn 3, the avatar of the big boss shows up, and he's there for exactly 3 turns. And then he disappears on him. He teleports out or something. You could put that in your notes. You can put it in your notes that once X number of the initial combatants die, these other combatants come into the battle. And that's built into certain monsters. Like, certain monsters are transformative or something to where it says, like, for instance, the zombie has undead fortitude. When you drop it to 0, it has a chance to come back at 1 hit point, which is kind of like having another combatant come back in, because they fight just as good at 1 hit point as they do at full hit points. And so it's built into that monster. Oozes split when you get them down to a certain hit point total, or you use certain types of attacks on them, and they become multiple monsters. So it's built into some monsters as an example. But that's one thing you can do for wave type encounters. That's more advanced encounter building. The other more advanced counter building is really kind of reserved for mini boss and boss encounters. And this, of course, does borrow from the books and video games side of things. Some of the most exciting video game bosses and mini bosses are the ones that you come up and you attack him, and then partway through that boss encounter, they change. They change form, they change attacks, um, the environment changes. They're what I call transformative creatures, or mutagenic creatures, is you could also use. An example, probably the one I like to use the most, would be like a primordial elemental boss. And how you break them down usually is you give, instead of a total hit point count, you give them hit point thresholds. And each form has a hit point threshold. And once you pass that hit point threshold, they go into the next form. And you may or may not do any overflow damage to the next threshold. I usually don't. So, like, I could have a primordial elemental. He's basically a personification of all four elements. And he first encounters the party as a earth elemental, or whatever given elemental. We'll say he's an earth elemental, and he has a 100 hit point threshold for earth elemental. And while he's an earth elemental, he has specific resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities, and specific attacks. Or as an earth elemental, he can slam, and he can grab a piece of his earthen form and throw it at you as a thrown rock. So he has a ranged and a melee attack. He's immune to non-magic slashing and piercing damage. He's vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, and he's vulnerable to thunder, which is the equivalent of sonic damage in Dungeons and Dragons. So things like thunderclap, thunderstep, and shatter work better on him. But he's immune to things. Now, the whole creature could be immune to some things, because as an elemental, you might say that they're immune to sleep and fear and possibly being knocked prone. You can decide that. But you can look at classic elemental immunities. Like a rock monster might be immune to petrification because he's already rock. He is already slowed, so maybe he's immune to any other slowing because he's already slow. If he's faster, he could be slowed. He could be vulnerable to slow. Usually, most elementals have a specific counter element that they're more vulnerable to. Force damage, for instance, would probably work much better against a stone earth elemental because it's like bludgeoning attacks. So force damage, thunder damage, and bludgeoning damage work really good. Non-magical slashing and piercing don't work at all. And as stone, you might say he's immune to cold damage, or he's immune to fire damage, or anyone lightning. He grounds out lightning, so lightning damage doesn't do anything. You know, it's all a matter of how you want to run it. But be consistent. Once you decide, stick with it. Once you get through that first 100 hit points, he transforms. The rocks fall away to show a molten interior. He's now more of a lava type fire elemental. He's got a whole new hit point threshold. Say it's another 100 hit points. He's now vulnerable to cold. He's vulnerable to water-based attacks. He's immune to fire completely. He's resistant to lightning attacks. He's resistant to piercing attacks. They just go right through him. So they do very minimal damage. Slashing attacks go right through him, do very minimal damage. Bludgeoning attacks, well, we can often kind of bludgeon a fire out, so bludgeoning might be one of his vulnerabilities. So he's vulnerable to bludgeoning. He's, like I said, he's vulnerable to cold and water-based attacks. Like I said, he might be resistant to lightning or thunder-based attacks, or he might be vulnerable to them. Wind-based attacks might actually have more of an effect on him. But the thing is, he's got those different things, and he's got different attack forms. Where the Earth Elemental had thrown rock and slam as his attacks, the Fire Elemental will have flow of lava as a ranged AoE type of attack, and burning touch as a melee attack. He could have a special defense called Wavering Form because of the heat shimmers around him, so that there's a percentage chance when you hit him that you don't, or he mitigates part of the damage. So that's a thing. And then when you get through his 100 hit points, then you see that the fire goes out, and beneath that molten lava, he actually transforms into a living wave of water. Because he's the primordial elemental, he's got all four elements into him, and it doesn't have to make sense going from one to the other. You can try to do it, but you won't always be able to do it. But now he's a water elemental. Now, water elementals are immune to water damage. Cold damage slows them but doesn't damage them. They're vulnerable to fire damage. And he's got a couple of attacks. He's got a drowning grapple attack where he actually grabs somebody and then as a bonus action gets to attempt to drown them, doing damage. And the whole time they're grappled, they take auto damage from the drown. They get a free bonus attack, bonus action drown, and they can create as many pseudopods as they want. So say he gets to do 3 attacks in a round because he can create up to 3 pseudopods. But if he's holding anybody in his grapple, that takes one of his attacks. That's perfectly acceptable. Slashing and piercing again probably don't do much to him, but neither does bludgeoning. So you could say non-magical weapon attacks don't affect him. And that changes the scheme of the thing. And then finally, you get through his 100-point threshold to the final form. The final form here is an air elemental. Well, air elementals, since they're made of basically controlled compressed air, are nigh on invisible. So you're disadvantaged to attack them automatically for the invisibleness, unless you have an ability to see the invisible. Something like Tremor Sense or True Sight or something to counteract that, or you cast Fairy Fire on him to make it to where the invisibility doesn't really count because they're mostly invisible. Air elementals again are probably not affected by slashing or piercing damage or bludgeoning damage. So they're just like their water cousin, they're immune to non-magical attacks. But they might not have any immunities to any kind of magical attack except maybe sonic attacks. Thunder is too close to their own element, so they don't care one lick about it. Or fire has nothing to grab onto, so fire doesn't affect them. Something like that. It's all completely up to you when you're building the monster. Just be consistent, as I said. Look at other elementals for inspiration. And this is just one example of a multi-part boss. And he has the final hit point threshold. Now, his hit point threshold, since being the final boss, might be 150, 200 hit points. Look at what the hit point average is for a creature of the level that you're trying to make him the challenge rating of. And this is, again, where we would look at challenge ratings and try to make their overall hit points somewhere close to that. So if a typical creature of this type has around 400 hit points, then just the 4 forms at 100 are fine. You might want to give them the each form 125 or 150, just so that the individual creatures count seem to be a little bit tougher. That's completely up to you. Again, art, not science. The other thing you can do with these creatures is adjust the environment based on the form of the boss. So when it's an earth elemental, they could have a lair action they can do once per combat round either at its own initiative or at the end of the combat round, or as reaction at the end of one player's attack, to have an earth spike shoot up underneath one of the characters, causing damage, or a stalactite fall down and hitting one of the characters, doing damage, where they get a chance to do like a dex saving throw. When they switch to the fire elemental, they might create lava rivers that the players have to look out for, or lava pools, so that certain areas become no-go and they no longer have a direct route to them. They might have to jump onto floating safe zones in the lava to get close enough to melee attack the creature. So melee attacks are not necessarily the best bet, but ranged are. On the other hand, the monster's ranged attack is pretty killer, so you might want to get close. You never know. Then the water elemental might every once in a while send freezing rain at the characters, or the ground might become swampy and difficult terrain, so the whole area is difficult terrain now. Each elemental might bring you to a subset of their elemental plane for the combat. A little bubble of their elemental plane is now in the combat area. So, like air elemental, you might have to be forced to fly or jump from little floating islands or whatever to do any kind of attack. This is, of course, very video gamey, but as video games are inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, there's nothing wrong with Dungeons and Dragons being inspired by video games. And many novels and books use similar tactics for their big set piece battles. This is what's called a set piece battle, or an iconic epic battle. It's not your run-of-the-mill battle. This is your ones that are usually on your boss battles, like I said. So when you're going to build a encounter, you're going to want to modify the encounters to make sure your party is having an interesting, fun, challenging time of it. And sometimes the challenge of the encounter is the fact that they've already had 5 encounters in the day and they're running low on resources. So a party that's down to less than half of their resources is going to find a medium encounter is more like hard. And a hard encounter is more like deadly because they don't have the extra resources to compensate. Because if you remember, your medium encounters uses up like 20% or more of your resources. Well, if you're down to 50% of your resources, that means that it's now using 40%, almost 50% of your resources. So it's coming close to deadly again. And the same thing with your deadly encounter. Your deadly encounters can use up to 100% of your resources. You never know. So you want as many resources as possible going into your deadly encounters. You usually want to set a rest point right before a major boss encounter. Usually. At least a short rest. But if you can, you want to give them some ability to get some resources back, or throw in a couple of NPC retainers or something to add to their resources. Give them a couple of magic items to give them more resources, like throw a few healing potions right before the boss battle, or throw a limited use item like a scroll of magic missiles or wand of magic missiles that is unstable and is only good for that one day, or even you can keep it. And remember, as a final note on magic items, which I haven't talked too much about in encounter building, intelligent bipedal boss monsters creatures, period, bipedals especially, bipedal meaning 2 arms, 2 legs generally, but the main thing is they got 2 hands, can use most magic items that players can use. So if you put it in their treasure, think if the monster or NPC can use it. A centaur can use upper body armor. Whether they will or not, that's up to you. But they can. An evil necromancer can use the wand of magic missiles. The necromancer can use the staff of the magi. I mean, Orcus has the rod of Orcus. It says it's in his equipment. And you don't necessarily increase the challenge rating for these magic items, because the justification for adding these magic items is that the players get awarded with the magic items and also have the potential to disarm or deactivate said magic items in the combat. So you don't necessarily have to say that combat is harder just because they're using the magic item. Sometimes it is. But if the reward is harder, they don't necessarily need to get more experience or anything for that. So keep that into the front of your mind. Again, as I reiterated several times throughout this, character encounters are an art, not a science. DMing is an art, not a science, that you can break down, but you don't want to totally eliminate. I want to thank you for listening. If anybody will be listening to this, I'm going to be offering to upload this to the Visioncon virtual convention in the 1st of May as a replacement for panels I would have done. I still may do other panels before then. We got a little bit of time. But again, thank you. I'm Doc, and you can find me once the quarantine's over with in metagames gaming several days a week. I'm often on our Facebook group, which is Springfield Metagames D&D. I have a few groups of my own, including Springfield Gamer Hookup, My Fuzzy Sidekicks, and other non-game related ones like Karaoke Junkies of Springfield, Missouri. So some of my broadcasts in the Raw will be karaoke related, not D&D related. Sometimes I might even do commentary on the quarantine. You never know. But thank you once again, and may all your rolls be 20s, especially if you're a DM. And good night.